Narcissists do not fear loud people. They do not fear anger, emotional reactions, or endless arguments. In fact, emotional chaos often gives them power because chaos keeps attention focused on them. What truly unsettles a narcissist is something far more dangerous. Emotional independence, clarity, and words that remove their control completely. Most people misunderstand narcissistic behavior because they focus only on arrogance, manipulation, or selfishness on the surface. But beneath all of it is a fragile psychological structure desperately trying to protect itself from shame, insecurity, rejection, and loss of control. Narcissists build identities around validation, superiority, attention, and emotional influence because internally they fear powerlessness more than almost anything else. This is why certain words become psychologically threatening to them. Not because the words are aggressive, but because the words expose truth, remove emotional control, and interrupt manipulation patterns they rely on to maintain psychological dominance. The first dangerous phrase is simple. I see what you're doing. Nothing disrupts manipulation faster than awareness. Narcissistic individuals rely heavily on confusion, emotional pressure, guilt, projection, gaslighting, and subtle control tactics. Their influence works best when the other person doubts themselves emotionally. The moment someone clearly recognizes the pattern without emotional collapse, the narcissist loses psychological advantage. Awareness removes the illusion. This is why emotionally intelligent calmness unsettles manipulative people deeply. They expect emotional reactions. They expect defensiveness, confusion, guilt, or endless attempts to explain. But calm observation changes the entire dynamic. When someone says, I see what you're doing, without emotional chaos attached to it, the narcissist realizes something important. The control mechanism is no longer invisible. And once manipulation becomes visible, it becomes weaker. The second dangerous phrase is no, simple, direct, calm, unapologetic. Most people do not realize how powerful boundaries are psychologically because they are terrified of rejection, conflict, or disapproval. Narcissistic personalities often survive by testing boundaries constantly. They push emotionally, manipulate expectations, demand attention, create guilt, and pressure others into abandoning their own needs. People trapped in these dynamics often over-explain themselves because they seek permission to protect their own peace. But healthy boundaries do not require endless justification. A calm no without guilt becomes deeply threatening to controlling individuals because it signals emotional independence. It says, you no longer control my decisions, emotions, or identity. That is dangerous to someone addicted to influence. Narcissists often react strongly to boundaries because boundaries expose their inability to dominate emotionally. Rage, guilt tactics, silent treatment, victimhood, blame shifting, or emotional withdrawal may appear immediately afterward. Why? Because boundaries interrupt access. And when access to emotional control disappears, panic often hides underneath the narcissist's reaction. The third dangerous phrase is, I don't need your approval. This sentence attacks the very foundation of narcissistic influence. Many narcissistic dynamics are built around validation control. Approval becomes a psychological weapon. Attention is given and withdrawn strategically. Affection becomes conditional. Criticism becomes a tool for destabilizing confidence. Why? Because insecure people are easier to control emotionally. Someone desperate for validation becomes psychologically dependent. Their self-worth starts revolving around external approval instead of internal stability. Narcissists understand this consciously or unconsciously, which is why they often alternate between praise and criticism to maintain emotional dependence. But the moment someone genuinely stops needing approval, the dynamic changes completely. Emotional freedom cannot be manipulated easily. A person who validates themselves internally becomes harder to control through guilt, praise, rejection, or emotional withdrawal. Their nervous system becomes more stable because identity no longer depends entirely on external validation. This creates psychological resistance. Narcissists often lose interest or become more aggressive when emotional dependency disappears because control weakens dramatically. The manipulation patterns no longer produce the same emotional reactions. And this reveals something important. Many controlling people are not attached to love, they are attached to influence. Real love respects individuality. Control fears individuality. This is why emotionally strong people become difficult for narcissists to dominate. Emotional strength does not mean aggression. It means clarity. It means self-respect. It means emotional regulation under pressure. It means observing patterns instead of constantly reacting emotionally. Narcissistic personalities often depend on emotional confusion to maintain power. Confused people question themselves constantly. Emotionally exhausted people become easier to manipulate. Insecure people seek approval repeatedly. But awareness interrupts all of it. The moment someone starts recognizing repeated patterns instead of isolated emotional moments, manipulation loses power. Gaslighting weakens. Guilt tactics weaken. Emotional intimidation weakens. Because truth becomes visible. Another thing narcissists deeply dislike hearing is silence itself. Not emotional withdrawal driven by fear, but calm emotional detachment. Silence without explanation. Distance without drama. Peace without permission. Why is this so threatening? Because narcissistic personalities often feed psychologically on emotional reaction. Attention, validation, chaos, admiration, conflict, and control all create stimulation. Emotional disengagement removes that fuel source completely. And when someone emotionally detaches without seeking approval, the narcissist loses emotional leverage. This is why healing often looks quiet. Not revenge, not obsession, not endless explanation. Just clarity, boundaries, emotional independence, and refusal to participate in manipulation patterns anymore. The deeper truth is that narcissistic behavior survives through emotional dependence. The more emotionally dependent someone becomes, the easier they are to influence. But the stronger someone becomes internally, the harder manipulation becomes. Self-respect changes everything. The moment a person trusts their own perception, values their peace, and stops abandoning themselves to maintain approval, the entire psychological structure shifts. Because the most dangerous thing to a narcissist is not anger. It is someone who sees clearly, stands calmly, and no longer needs permission to walk away. Most narcissistic manipulation survives through invisibility. The control works best when the other person cannot clearly identify what is happening psychologically. Confusion becomes the environment where manipulation grows strongest. Self-doubt weakens perception. Emotional overwhelm disrupts clarity. And the more uncertain someone becomes internally, the easier they are to influence emotionally. This is why awareness becomes so threatening to narcissistic personalities. Narcissists often depend on subtle psychological tactics rather than obvious control in the beginning. They may distort conversations, deny previous behavior, shift blame, create guilt, invalidate emotions, project their own flaws onto others, or subtly change emotional dynamics to maintain influence. These behaviors often happen gradually, making the target question themselves instead of questioning the manipulation pattern. The goal is not always conscious evil. Often it is psychological survival. Many narcissistic individuals are deeply driven by fear of losing control, rejection, or emotional exposure. Maintaining influence over others creates temporary emotional security for them. If they can control perception, reactions, or emotional dependency, they feel safer internally. This is why manipulation thrives when awareness is weak. A confused person becomes easier to direct emotionally. Someone constantly defending themselves loses emotional stability. A person trapped in endless explanation begins doubting their own reality over time. The narcissist gains psychological advantage because the focus shifts away from their behavior and toward the target's emotional reaction. But awareness interrupts this cycle immediately. The moment someone calmly recognizes manipulation patterns, the entire dynamic begins changing. Not because the narcissist suddenly transforms, but because the emotional invisibility disappears. The tactics no longer operate unconsciously. This is why phrases like "I see what you're doing" become psychologically disruptive. Not because they are aggressive, but because they expose hidden dynamics directly. The narcissist realizes the other person is no longer emotionally unconscious inside the interaction. The manipulation pattern has been observed instead of absorbed. Awareness removes illusion. This is one of the reasons emotionally intelligent calmness becomes so powerful. Narcissistic personalities often expect emotional reactions because emotional chaos creates opportunities for control. Anger, defensiveness, guilt, confusion, emotional breakdowns, endless arguing, all of these reactions keep the narcissist psychologically central within the interaction. But calm observation changes the structure completely. A calm person who sees clearly becomes difficult to manipulate because they stop reacting automatically. They begin studying patterns instead of isolated emotional moments. They stop asking, "How do I make this person understand me?" and start asking, "Why does this pattern repeat consistently?" That question creates awakening. Repeated behavior becomes impossible to ignore once awareness develops. The blame shifting becomes visible. The emotional inconsistency becomes visible. The guilt tactics become visible. The need for control becomes visible. And once patterns become visible, emotional confusion weakens dramatically. Narcissists often dislike this because manipulation depends heavily on emotional uncertainty. If someone trusts their own perception clearly, the narcissist loses one of their strongest psychological advantages. This is why gaslighting exists. Gaslighting attempts to distort someone's confidence in their own memory, emotions, perception, or interpretation of events. The goal is psychological destabilization. If someone begins questioning themselves constantly, they become easier to influence emotionally. But awareness protects against this. A person who recognizes manipulation patterns stops depending entirely on the narcissist's interpretation of reality. They begin trusting behavioral consistency instead of emotional performance. They notice contradictions between words and actions. They observe repeated cycles instead of focusing only on temporary apologies or emotional intensity. Awareness creates emotional distance. That distance is dangerous to manipulative people because emotional control weakens when clarity increases. The person becomes harder to destabilize emotionally. They stop reacting impulsively. They stop needing constant validation. They stop over-explaining themselves endlessly. And this changes the power dynamic completely. Another reason awareness feels threatening is because narcissistic individuals often rely on carefully maintained identity structures. They want to be perceived a certain way: superior, innocent, admired, misunderstood, powerful, or emotionally justified. Awareness threatens those identities because it exposes inconsistency underneath the performance. Truth destabilizes illusion. A person who calmly sees through manipulation no longer reinforces the false narrative automatically. That creates discomfort because narcissistic control depends heavily on maintaining emotional influence over perception. The deeper truth is that manipulation cannot survive clearly observed patterns forever. It depends on emotional blindness, confusion, and repeated unconscious participation. Once someone becomes psychologically aware, they begin recognizing emotional traps before falling fully into them. This does not mean they become cold or paranoid. It means they become conscious. And consciousness changes everything because the most dangerous thing to manipulation is not aggression. It is someone who sees the pattern clearly and refuses to lose themselves inside it anymore. One of the most powerful words in human psychology is also one of the simplest: no. Yet for many people, saying it feels terrifying. They fear rejection, conflict, abandonment, disapproval, guilt, or emotional tension. Because of this fear, they constantly over-explain themselves, sacrifice their own peace, and ignore their own emotional boundaries just to keep others comfortable. This is exactly why boundaries become so threatening to narcissistic personalities. Narcissists often survive psychologically through access and influence. They test limits constantly to see how much emotional control they can maintain over another person. This may appear through guilt, pressure, emotional manipulation, criticism, silent treatment, entitlement, excessive demands, or subtle emotional conditioning. The goal is not always obvious domination. Often it is about maintaining psychological access to someone's energy, attention, emotions, and decisions. Boundaries interrupt that access. A calm, unapologetic no signals something powerful psychologically: emotional independence. It communicates that the person is no longer abandoning themselves simply to avoid discomfort or maintain approval. And for someone addicted to control, this becomes deeply unsettling. Most people misunderstand boundaries because they associate them with aggression or selfishness. But healthy boundaries are not attacks. They are acts of self-respect. A boundary simply defines where your emotional responsibility ends and another person's begins. Narcissistic individuals often react strongly to boundaries because boundaries expose the limits of their influence. If someone can no longer guilt you into compliance, pressure you emotionally, manipulate your empathy, or destabilize your confidence, then their control weakens dramatically. This is why even calm boundaries may trigger intense reactions from controlling personalities. The reaction itself often reveals the problem. Emotionally healthy people may feel disappointed occasionally when hearing no, but they generally respect boundaries over time because they understand individuality and emotional autonomy. Narcissistic personalities, however, may interpret boundaries as rejection, disrespect, disobedience, or loss of control. This creates emotional escalation. Suddenly, guilt appears, anger appears, blame appears, victimhood appears, silent treatment appears, emotional withdrawal appears. Why? Because the nervous system of the narcissist perceives reduced control as psychological threat. Control creates emotional safety for them. When someone begins saying no calmly and consistently, the narcissist realizes they can no longer fully dominate the emotional dynamic. That realization creates insecurity underneath the surface reaction. This is why many people struggle to maintain boundaries in toxic relationships. The emotional backlash feels overwhelming at first. People often mistake the narcissist's reaction as proof that the boundary itself is wrong. But in reality, strong negative reactions often reveal how necessary the boundary was. Healthy boundaries expose unhealthy dependence. Another reason boundaries are psychologically powerful is because they force accountability. Narcissistic manipulation often relies on emotional flexibility from the other person. The narcissist expects exceptions, emotional accommodation, endless patience, or constant access. Boundaries interrupt this expectation by introducing emotional structure. Structure weakens manipulation. A person with strong boundaries no longer reacts automatically to guilt, pressure, or emotional intensity. They become more stable internally because decisions stop depending entirely on fear of other people's reactions. This changes the nervous system over time. People who constantly abandon their own needs to maintain approval often become emotionally exhausted, anxious, resentful, and psychologically fragmented. Why? Because the mind recognizes self-betrayal even when the behavior becomes habitual. Every ignored boundary weakens self-trust slightly. But every respected boundary strengthens self-respect. The nervous system begins learning that personal peace matters too. Emotional stability increases because identity no longer revolves entirely around external validation. This is dangerous to controlling personalities because emotionally independent people are much harder to manipulate. A narcissist often expects emotional negotiation after a boundary. They expect endless explanation, guilt, self-doubt, or emotional collapse. But calm firmness removes those openings. A simple no without emotional chaos communicates confidence internally. Not arrogance, not cruelty, clarity. And clarity disrupts manipulation because manipulation depends heavily on emotional confusion and self-doubt. Another important truth is this: boundaries reveal relationship quality very quickly. The moment someone protects their peace, unhealthy individuals often become exposed through their reactions. Some people only feel comfortable with you when you have no boundaries at all. That is not love. That is access. Real respect includes respect for individuality, emotional space, and personal autonomy. Someone who truly values you may not always agree with your boundaries, but they will not continuously punish you for having them. The deeper truth is that boundaries are not just external rules. They are psychological declarations of self-worth. They communicate to your nervous system that your emotions, energy, time, and peace deserve protection too. And once someone learns to say no calmly without apologizing for existing, the entire dynamic of manipulation begins collapsing. One of the biggest sources of manipulation in human relationships is emotional dependency. The moment someone's self-worth becomes dependent on another person's approval, attention, validation, or acceptance, psychological control becomes possible. This is why emotional independence is so powerful and why narcissists fear it deeply. Narcissistic personalities often build relationships around validation control. Attention, affection, praise, criticism, rejection, and approval become emotional tools used to influence behavior. Sometimes this happens consciously. Sometimes it happens automatically through deeply conditioned psychological patterns. But the result is the same. The narcissist maintains emotional power by controlling how valued the other person feels. This creates emotional instability in the relationship. One moment there is praise, affection, attention, or admiration. The next moment there is criticism, emotional withdrawal, coldness, guilt, or rejection. This inconsistency is not random. It creates psychological dependency because the nervous system begins chasing emotional reassurance constantly. The person starts asking themselves, how do I get back the approval I had before? That question creates emotional vulnerability. People trapped in these dynamics slowly begin shaping their behavior around maintaining validation. They over-explain themselves, tolerate disrespect, suppress emotions, seek permission, avoid conflict, and abandon personal boundaries simply to avoid emotional withdrawal or criticism. The narcissist gains influence because the other person's emotional state becomes externally controlled. This is why emotional independence becomes so dangerous to narcissistic individuals. The moment someone stops needing constant approval, the manipulation pattern weakens dramatically. A person who validates themselves internally cannot be controlled as easily through praise or rejection. This changes everything psychologically. When someone genuinely stops depending on external validation for identity, their nervous system becomes more stable. Criticism still exists, but it no longer destroys their self-worth completely. Rejection still hurts, but it no longer defines their identity. Emotional withdrawal no longer creates panic because internal value no longer depends entirely on another person's attention. That stability removes emotional leverage. Narcissists often react strongly when this happens because emotional dependence was the foundation of control. If someone no longer fears losing approval constantly, manipulation tactics become less effective. Guilt loses power. Silent treatment loses power. Emotional inconsistency loses power. The dynamic begins collapsing. This is why emotionally independent people often appear harder to control. They are not emotionally cold. They simply do not abandon themselves to maintain external validation anymore. There is a massive difference between connection and dependency. Healthy connection allows individuality. Dependency sacrifices individuality for emotional survival. Narcissistic dynamics often blur this line intentionally. They make emotional approval feel scarce, conditional, and unstable, so the other person becomes more psychologically attached. Conditional validation creates emotional addiction. The nervous system starts chasing moments of approval the same way it chases relief from uncertainty. This creates cycles of emotional highs and lows that strengthen attachment even when the relationship becomes psychologically unhealthy. But emotional independence interrupts the cycle. The moment someone realizes, I do not need constant approval to have value, emotional clarity begins returning. They stop interpreting every criticism as proof of worthlessness. They stop fighting endlessly for emotional permission to exist peacefully. This is deeply threatening to narcissistic personalities because control depends heavily on insecurity. Insecure people are easier to manipulate emotionally. Someone constantly seeking validation can be influenced through approval, and rejection. But someone grounded internally becomes harder to destabilize because their identity no longer depends entirely on external emotional feedback. This does not mean emotionally independent people reject connection or love. It means they stop surrendering their self-worth to maintain attachment. That distinction is powerful. Another reason narcissists dislike emotional independence is because it exposes intention. Many manipulative dynamics survive because the target believes the narcissist's behavior is purely about love, care, or emotional need. But once emotional independence develops, patterns become clearer. The person begins noticing that certain behaviors were designed more around influence than genuine emotional intimacy. Control becomes visible. This often explains why narcissists may escalate emotionally when they sense independence growing. They may increase guilt, criticism, emotional pressure, victimhood, or attention-seeking behavior because the emotional grip is weakening. The narcissist senses loss of influence. But emotionally independent individuals respond differently. Instead of collapsing emotionally, they observe the patterns calmly. They stop seeking endless reassurance. They stop over-explaining themselves constantly. They stop sacrificing their peace to maintain approval. And this creates emotional freedom. The deeper truth is that people who truly value you do not require you to become emotionally dependent to keep the relationship alive. Healthy relationships support individuality, emotional stability, and self-respect. Manipulative relationships often depend on insecurity instead. Once someone learns to validate themselves internally, trust their perception, and protect their emotional peace, they become much harder to control psychologically. Because the strongest form of freedom is not physical distance. It is emotional independence from the need for someone else's approval to feel worthy. Most people see narcissism only from the outside. They see arrogance, entitlement, manipulation, attention-seeking, superiority, control, or lack of empathy. On the surface, narcissistic individuals often appear powerful, dominant, emotionally confident, or highly self-assured. But beneath that external image usually exists something much more fragile: deep insecurity, fear of rejection, fear of shame, and fear of losing control. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about narcissistic behavior. The arrogance is often compensation. The superiority is often protection. The constant need for admiration is often an attempt to escape internal emptiness or emotional inadequacy. Narcissistic behavior may look powerful externally, but psychologically, it is frequently driven by instability underneath. Many narcissists build identities designed to protect themselves from emotional vulnerability. They create psychological armor around the parts of themselves they fear most. Validation becomes a survival mechanism. Control becomes emotional security. Admiration becomes temporary relief from insecurity. This is why criticism feels so threatening to them. Even small challenges to their identity can trigger strong emotional reactions because the external image they project is holding together fragile internal self-worth. If someone questions their superiority, importance, intelligence, attractiveness, control, or status, it can feel psychologically destabilizing beneath the surface. The nervous system reacts defensively. This is why narcissistic personalities often become extremely reactive to accountability, rejection, boundaries, or emotional exposure. What may appear as anger, blame, manipulation, or emotional punishment is often a defense against internal shame and vulnerability. Shame is one of the deepest psychological fears underneath narcissism. Healthy individuals can usually tolerate imperfection without their entire identity collapsing. They can admit mistakes, experience criticism, and remain emotionally grounded even when uncomfortable emotions appear. Narcissistic personalities often struggle with this because their self-image is heavily dependent on external reinforcement. Without validation, the identity feels threatened. This creates constant psychological tension. The narcissist may spend enormous energy protecting image, status, admiration, or control because these external things help regulate internal insecurity temporarily. That is why admiration often feels addictive to them. Praise creates emotional relief. Attention creates stimulation. Control creates safety. Superiority creates distance from feelings of inadequacy. But because these things come externally, the relief is temporary. The insecurity underneath eventually returns, creating a cycle where more validation becomes necessary. This explains why many narcissists constantly seek attention, dominance, admiration, or emotional influence over others. The behavior is compensatory. Another important truth is that narcissistic individuals often fear emotional vulnerability deeply. Vulnerability requires authenticity, accountability, emotional openness, and the possibility of rejection. For someone carrying deep insecurity or shame internally, vulnerability feels dangerous. Control feels safer than vulnerability. This is why narcissists may avoid genuine emotional intimacy even while craving attention or admiration constantly. Real intimacy requires equality, empathy, emotional responsibility, and self-awareness. Narcissistic conditioning often interferes with these things because protecting the ego becomes more important than emotional connection. The relationship becomes centered around maintaining control instead of mutual emotional growth. This also explains why narcissists often struggle with accountability. Admitting fault threatens the carefully constructed self-image protecting them psychologically. Instead of processing guilt in healthy ways, they may project blame outward, deny reality, manipulate perception, or attack the other person emotionally. The ego defends itself aggressively. Projection becomes common because the narcissist unconsciously pushes unwanted feelings onto others. Their insecurity may appear as criticism. Their dishonesty may appear as accusations. Their emotional instability may appear as blame directed outward. The internal conflict gets externalized. Another reason narcissists fear losing control is because control helps regulate emotional uncertainty internally. If they can influence the emotional environment around them, they feel temporarily safer psychologically. This is why they may attempt to control conversations, emotions, relationships, narratives, or perceptions repeatedly. Uncertainty activates fear. When boundaries appear, emotional independence appears, or admiration disappears, the narcissist may react strongly because the nervous system perceives loss of control as emotional danger. This is important to understand because it changes perception completely. It does not excuse harmful behavior, but it explains why narcissistic behavior often appears emotionally extreme, defensive, or manipulative beneath the surface. The superiority is often protecting shame. The control is often protecting insecurity. And the constant need for validation is often protecting fragile self-worth that never became stable internally. The deeper truth is that emotionally healthy confidence does not require domination, endless admiration, or control over others. Real confidence can tolerate vulnerability, accountability, rejection, and imperfection without collapsing emotionally. Narcissistic behavior struggles with this because the identity depends too heavily on external reinforcement. And once you understand that many narcissistic behaviors are driven not by true inner strength, but by hidden insecurity and fear, the entire psychological dynamic becomes much clearer. Most manipulation does not happen through direct force. It happens through emotional influence. Human beings are emotional creatures first. And when emotions become activated, rational thinking temporarily weakens. This is why emotional reactions are one of the most powerful tools in psychological dynamics, and also why emotional reactions often become the very mechanism through which manipulation survives. When someone is emotionally reactive, their perception narrows. Instead of observing patterns calmly, they begin reacting instantly to words, tone, and behavior. Fear, anger, guilt, attraction, confusion, or insecurity can temporarily override logical evaluation. In that state, people often respond impulsively rather than thoughtfully. And in those impulsive responses, manipulation finds space to operate. This is why emotional chaos benefits controlling personalities. A person who is emotionally overwhelmed becomes easier to influence because they are no longer fully grounded in observation. They begin explaining themselves excessively, defending themselves emotionally, trying to fix misunderstandings immediately, or seeking approval to restore emotional balance. Each of these reactions shifts psychological control away from internal stability and toward external influence. Manipulation often relies on this shift. When someone is emotionally reactive, they may start doubting their own perception. They may overanalyze conversations, replay interactions repeatedly in their mind, or question whether they are overreacting. This internal confusion weakens confidence in their own judgment, making them more dependent on external validation or interpretation. This is where emotional dependency becomes stronger. Narcissistic or manipulative dynamics often encourage this state indirectly. Through inconsistent behavior, selective affection, criticism mixed with praise, guilt-inducing communication, or emotional unpredictability, the nervous system becomes unstable over time. The target begins seeking clarity and reassurance from the very source of confusion. This creates a psychological loop. Confusion leads to emotional reaction. Emotional reaction leads to overthinking. Overthinking leads to seeking validation. Seeking validation increases dependency. Increased dependency makes manipulation easier. Breaking this cycle requires awareness of emotional response patterns. When someone learns to observe their own emotional reactions instead of immediately acting on them, something changes. They begin creating a gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, clarity appears. Instead of reacting instantly, they begin analyzing what is actually happening beneath the emotional trigger. This is where psychological strength begins. Emotionally strong individuals are not people who feel nothing. They are people who can observe what they feel without being fully controlled by it. They can notice anger without acting impulsively. They can notice fear without collapsing into avoidance. They can notice confusion without immediately seeking external reassurance. This internal space creates emotional control. Manipulation weakens significantly when emotional reactions are no longer automatic. A calm mind can observe patterns that a reactive mind completely misses. For example, repeated guilt tactics become visible when you are not emotionally overwhelmed. Inconsistencies in behavior become noticeable when you are not seeking immediate validation. Subtle control attempts become clearer when you are not emotionally dependent on resolution. Awareness replaces reaction. This is one of the reasons emotional regulation is so important psychologically. It is not about suppressing feelings. It is about preventing emotions from making decisions on your behalf. Because when emotions decide everything, perception becomes distorted. Another important aspect is how emotional reactions affect communication. When someone is reactive, they often explain too much. They try to convince, justify, or defend themselves repeatedly. This creates an imbalance in communication because it gives the other person psychological leverage. The more you try to emotionally convince someone, the more power they hold over your emotional state. Calmness changes this dynamic completely. A calm response communicates internal stability. It signals that your emotional state is not easily controlled by external pressure. It removes urgency from manipulation attempts because there is no emotional chaos to exploit. This is why silence can also be powerful psychologically. Not silence from fear, but silence from clarity. Not avoidance, but observation. When someone stops reacting emotionally and starts observing behavior instead, manipulation loses much of its influence. The nervous system becomes regulated. Over time, emotionally stable individuals become harder to manipulate because their reactions are no longer predictable or easily triggered. They no longer respond immediately to guilt, pressure, emotional withdrawal, or validation games. Instead, they pause, observe, and evaluate patterns before responding. This creates psychological resistance. And once emotional reaction is replaced with awareness, manipulation loses its primary entry point. Because control only works when emotional responses are automatic, and awareness interrupts automatic behavior completely. The deepest form of psychological strength is not control over others, but control over yourself. Most people spend their energy trying to understand, change, or manage external behavior while ignoring the one thing that actually determines their emotional reality: their own level of awareness, self-respect, and internal stability. When someone develops real psychological clarity, they stop reacting blindly to situations and start responding from a grounded internal center. Self-respect is the foundation of this shift. Without self-respect, people unconsciously abandon their own needs to maintain approval, avoid conflict, or preserve relationships that are emotionally draining. They tolerate inconsistent behavior, over-explain their feelings, ignore their intuition, and accept dynamics that slowly weaken their emotional stability. Over time, this creates internal conflict because the mind recognizes when self-abandonment is happening, even if the person consciously ignores it. This is where emotional instability often begins. When someone consistently prioritizes external validation over internal peace, their sense of identity becomes dependent on other people's reactions. Approval feels like safety. Criticism feels like threat. Attention feels like worth. Rejection feels like collapse. This creates a fragile emotional structure that can be easily influenced by external behavior. Psychological freedom begins when this dependency breaks. Trusting your perception is a critical part of that freedom. Many people lose clarity in relationships because they second-guess their own interpretation of events. They feel something is wrong, but then dismiss it because the other person denies it or provides an alternative explanation. Over time, this disconnect between perception and external validation creates confusion. Self-trust restores internal alignment. When you trust your own perception, you begin observing behavior more clearly without immediately invalidating your instincts. You notice patterns, inconsistencies, emotional shifts, and repeated dynamics without forcing yourself to ignore them. This does not mean assuming the worst. It means allowing yourself to see reality without distortion. Protecting your peace is another essential part of this psychological shift. Peace is not just emotional comfort. It is mental clarity, nervous system stability, and psychological balance. When someone constantly engages in emotionally draining interactions, their thinking becomes clouded. They react more, reflect less. They become emotionally entangled instead of observationally aware. Protecting peace means choosing clarity over chaos. This often requires emotional detachment from unhealthy patterns. Not detachment from people entirely, but detachment from emotional manipulation, confusion cycles, and repeated psychological stress. It means refusing to participate in dynamics that consistently disturb your internal balance. Emotional detachment creates space for awareness. When you are no longer emotionally entangled in every reaction, comment, or behavior, you begin seeing patterns more clearly. You notice repetition instead of being caught in moment-to-moment emotional responses. You understand that behavior is often more important than words, and consistency matters more than isolated actions. This clarity strengthens decision-making. Instead of reacting impulsively, you begin responding intentionally. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself endlessly to be understood. You no longer chase emotional closure from people who consistently create confusion. You no longer sacrifice your peace for temporary emotional stability in unhealthy dynamics. Another important shift is emotional independence. Emotional independence does not mean disconnecting from relationships. It means your emotional state is not fully controlled by other people's approval, rejection, or attention. You can still feel emotions deeply, but you are no longer controlled by them. You can experience discomfort without losing your center. This creates resilience. Resilient individuals are not unaffected by life. They are stable within it. They experience emotional waves, but they do not lose themselves in those waves. They observe, process, and respond rather than react unconsciously. As this awareness grows, manipulation becomes significantly less effective, not because manipulation disappears, but because the internal conditions that allow manipulation weaken. Guilt no longer destabilizes you as easily. Emotional pressure no longer controls your decisions. Inconsistency no longer confuses you for long periods. You begin seeing patterns quickly. And when patterns are seen clearly, emotional confusion dissolves. You stop needing constant reassurance because you trust your perception. You stop over-explaining yourself because your boundaries are clear. You stop abandoning your needs because your self-respect becomes stronger than fear of disapproval. This is the real transformation. Not becoming distant or cold, but becoming internally stable enough that external behavior no longer defines your emotional reality. You begin responding from clarity instead of confusion, from awareness instead of reaction, and from self-respect instead of emotional dependency. And once that level of psychological stability is reached, you are no longer easily controlled by external dynamics, because the strongest protection against manipulation is not resistance to others, but complete alignment with yourself. In the end, everything comes down to one central truth. Human behavior is far more revealing than human words. People can say almost anything, but their emotions, patterns, reactions under pressure, attention, and consistency always expose what is happening beneath the surface. Nothing stays hidden forever when you learn how to observe psychology instead of reacting only to language. Manipulation only works in the presence of emotional blindness, confusion, and automatic reaction. But the moment awareness increases, everything begins to change. You start noticing contradictions between words and behavior. You see how pressure reveals character. You recognize how attention exposes hidden priorities. You understand how repeated patterns reveal identity far more accurately than temporary performances. And most importantly, you begin to see yourself more clearly, too. Because psychological awareness is not just about understanding others, it is about understanding how easily emotions can influence perception, decisions, and self-worth. When you stop reacting impulsively and start observing calmly, you create space between emotion and action. In that space, clarity grows. And in that clarity, manipulation loses its power. Real strength is not emotional hardness. It is emotional stability. It is the ability to stay grounded when others are reactive, to observe without confusion, and to respond from awareness instead of fear. It is the ability to trust your perception, protect your peace, and maintain self-respect even when external pressure tries to pull you off balance. Once you reach that level of awareness, people no longer appear confusing, only patterns become visible. And when patterns become clear, emotional chaos turns into understanding, and understanding turns into freedom. Because in the end, the strongest position you can ever reach is not controlling others, but being so aware of human behavior and so aligned with yourself that no external influence can easily distort your inner reality again.